At 2:34 this afternoon, the president posted on social media a demand that has never been made by any American president in history. Quote, Canada owes the United States $2.8 trillion in unfair trade advantages accumulated over decades. I am directing Treasury to calculate exact damages and commerce to prepare enforcement mechanisms. Canada has 72 hours to negotiate payment terms or face consequences. The post included no legal citation, no congressional authorization, and no consultation with State Department or Treasury. This is the president unilaterally demanding $2.8 trillion from a foreign ally with zero constitutional basis. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what I am about to walk you through is not a trade dispute or tariff negotiation. This is the president claiming authority to impose financial penalties on sovereign nations without congressional approval, without treaty process, and without any mechanism in the Constitution that grants him this power. Turn on notifications, set them to all, because the constitutional crisis that just erupted is whether a president can conduct foreign economic policy through social media posts that bypass every institution designed to check executive power. At 3:47 p.m., Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney held an emergency press conference in Ottawa. Quote, the president's demand has no basis in law, no basis in our trade agreements, and no basis in reality. Canada does not owe the United States $2.8 trillion. We will not negotiate under threat. We will not comply with demands issued via social media. And we call on the U.S. Congress to clarify whether this represents official American policy or the personal position of one individual. Carney then announced he was recalling Canada's ambassador for consultations and suspending all bilateral trade negotiations until Congress confirms whether it supports the president's position. At 4:15 p.m., Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair Ben Cardin issued a statement. Quote, the president does not have authority to levy fines on foreign nations. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress sole power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The president has no constitutional mechanism to demand payment from Canada. This is executive overreach. Within 30 minutes, 23 senators from both parties signed onto Cardin's statement. The Senate is saying the president exceeded his authority. Hit that like button right now if you understand what just happened. The president made a $2.8 trillion demand that has no legal foundation. Canada refused, and the Senate declared the demand unconstitutional. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to see it. At 5:03 p.m., the White House released a statement defending the president's authority. Quote, the president has broad powers under Article 2 to conduct foreign policy and protect American economic interests. Decades of unfair trade practices by Canada have cost American workers trillions. The president is exercising his constitutional duty to remedy this injustice. Congressional authorization is not required for the president to negotiate with foreign governments. That is the White House claiming executive foreign policy powers override congressional trade authority. At 5:34 p.m., the Commerce Department released internal analysis that directly contradicts the $2.8 trillion figure. According to the report, total U.S.-Canada trade deficit over the past 30 years amounts to approximately $140 billion, not $2.8 trillion. The $2.8 trillion number appears to have no economic basis. When asked where the figure originated, White House press secretary declined to provide supporting documentation. This suggests the demand is not based on actual economic calculation, but on presidential assertion. At 5:47 p.m., House Speaker Mike Johnson was asked whether the president needs congressional approval. He stated, Congress has constitutional authority over foreign commerce. Any agreement involving payment of $2.8 trillion would require congressional approval. I have not been consulted. The Foreign Affairs Committee has not been consulted. This appears to be unilateral executive action. Johnson stopped short of condemning the demand, but made clear Congress was not involved. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think the president can demand trillions from foreign countries without congressional approval. I am reading every response because this is the question constitutional scholars are debating tonight. At 6:34 p.m., Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent held a closed meeting with department officials. According to sources present, Bessent told staff, the president has directed us to calculate enforcement mechanisms. I need options for how we compel payment if Canada refuses. Staff responded that no such mechanisms exist. The United States cannot seize Canadian assets without violating international law. Treasury cannot impose fines on sovereign nations. When Besant asked about tariffs, staff noted that tariffs require statutory authority under Trade Act provisions and cannot exceed certain percentages without congressional approval. At 7:15 p.m., the Canadian dollar dropped 3.4% against the U.S. dollar. Markets are reacting to the possibility of trade war. At 7:23 p.m., the Dow futures fell 480 points. Wall Street is pricing an economic disruption. By 7:45 p.m., trading in Canadian bank stocks was halted on the Toronto Stock Exchange after shares of Royal Bank of Canada fell 8% in 30 minutes. The economic contagion is spreading faster than anyone anticipated. At 8:12 p.m., the European Union issued a statement through the European Commission. Quote, the EU is monitoring the situation between the United States and Canada with serious concern. Any attempt to impose unilateral financial demands on trading partners outside established international frameworks sets a dangerous precedent. We stand in solidarity with Canada and call for respect for international trade law. That is the EU warning that executive economic threats undermine the entire global trading system. At 8:34 p.m., Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum convened an emergency cabinet meeting. According to sources in Mexico City, officials are discussing whether Mexico could face similar demands. The U.S. trade deficit with Mexico is larger than with Canada. If the president claims authority to demand payment from Canada for accumulated trade imbalances, the same logic applies to Mexico. Mexican officials are reportedly preparing defensive economic measures, including potential currency controls and export restrictions on critical minerals. Let me show you the historical parallel, because this has happened once before and it ended a presidency. In 1971, President Nixon unilaterally suspended dollar convertibility to gold and imposed a 10% import surcharge without congressional approval. He claimed emergency economic powers under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Congress erupted. The Senate Finance Committee held emergency hearings. Within 90 days, Nixon was forced to negotiate with allies and lift the surcharge. But Nixon had statutory authority under a 1917 law. This president has no statute. He is claiming inherent Article 2 power that does not exist in the constitutional text. Here is what we are watching for over the next 72 hours. 6 indicators that will tell us how this crisis resolves. Indicator 1, does Congress take a formal position? If the House and Senate pass resolutions stating the president lacks authority to demand payment from Canada, it creates constitutional confrontation. Indicator 2, does Treasury produce any enforcement mechanism? If Besant announces specific actions Treasury will take, it means the administration is escalating. If Treasury remains silent, it suggests they cannot find legal basis. Indicator 3, does Canada retaliate economically? If Carney imposes counter tariffs or restricts exports to the U.S., the trade war begins. Indicator 4, do any Republican senators publicly break with the president? If senators like Mitt Romney or Susan Collins state the demand is unconstitutional, it signals bipartisan opposition. Indicator 5, does the president walk back the 72-hour deadline? If the White House quietly extends or abandons the timeline, it suggests retreat. If they enforce it, confrontation continues. Indicator 6, do markets continue falling? If stocks drop further and the dollar weakens, economic pressure may force resolution. Subscribe right now, like this video, comment with your prediction on what happens when the 72-hour deadline expires Saturday afternoon. Let me show you the constitutional framework. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, to lay and collect duties, and to borrow money. Article 2 grants the president power to make treaties with Senate approval and to receive ambassadors. Nowhere does the Constitution grant the president authority to unilaterally levy fines on foreign countries or demand payment outside treaty process. The president can negotiate, but any agreement requiring payment would need congressional approval, especially $2.8 trillion, which represents 40% of the entire federal budget. At 8:47 p.m., former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was interviewed. Quote, this demand has no legal mechanism for enforcement. The United States cannot sue Canada in international court for trade imbalances. We cannot seize Canadian assets without violating sovereignty. Tariffs are the only tool, but tariffs are taxes on Americans, not on Canada. The president appears to believe he can issue demands and Canada will comply out of fear, but that is not how international relations work among allied democracies. At 9:34 p.m., the Pentagon issued internal guidance to commanders. According to sources who reviewed the document, military officials were directed to prepare assessments of how a trade war with Canada would affect defense cooperation. The U.S. and Canada share NORAD Air Defense Command. They coordinate on Arctic security. They have integrated supply chains for defense manufacturing. If economic conflict escalates, military cooperation could fracture. The guidance reportedly states, Commanders should not assume current bilateral defense arrangements remain stable if economic confrontation intensifies. Here are the three scenarios for how this resolves. Scenario one, the president backs down. Faced with congressional opposition, Treasury inability to find enforcement mechanisms, market panic, and Pentagon warnings about defense cooperation risks, the White House quietly announces the $2.8 trillion figure was opening negotiating position for broader trade talks. The deadline passes without action. Canada returns ambassador. Markets stabilize. The president claims victory by saying Canada agreed to renegotiate trade terms, even though no payment occurred. This is the face-saving retreat scenario. Scenario two, the president imposes tariffs without congressional approval. When the deadline expires and Canada refuses payment, the president announces 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports using emergency economic powers. Congress sues, arguing tariffs of that magnitude require statutory authority. Courts issue preliminary injunction. Tariffs are blocked, but constitutional crisis over executive trade authority continues for months. This is the escalation through executive action scenario. Scenario three, the standoff triggers economic crisis. Markets continue falling as investors fear trade war. The Canadian dollar collapses. American companies dependent on Canadian supply chains face shortages. Congress passes resolution condemning president's demand, but cannot compel him to withdraw it. Canada retaliates with export restrictions on critical minerals and energy. The U.S. and Canada, the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, valued at $780 billion annually, enter economic conflict that neither side can win. This is the mutual destruction scenario. What I know for certain right now, the president demanded $2.8 trillion from Canada. He set a 72-hour deadline. Canada refused. The Senate declared he lacks authority. Treasury cannot find enforcement mechanism. Markets are falling. The EU issued a warning. Mexico is preparing defensive measures. The Pentagon is preparing for defense cooperation breakdown. And in 72 hours, either the president enforces his demand through some unilateral executive action, or he backs down and claims victory anyway, or the crisis escalates into trade war between the closest economic partners on Earth. This is separation of powers at maximum tension. The president claims Article 2 foreign policy authority. Congress claims Article 1 commerce authority. And a foreign allied democracy is caught in the middle of an American constitutional crisis over who controls trade policy. The next 72 hours will determine whether the president can conduct economic foreign policy through social media demands or whether constitutional limits on executive power still constrain presidential action. Stay with this channel, turn on notifications. When the 72-hour deadline expires Saturday at 2:34 p.m., you will see the analysis here immediately.